John, you there? Why don't we go ahead and get started?
All right, that sounds good, Joe. It's great to be with everybody today as we spend our time, the short time that we have together, on focusing on ROI, but maybe not the way that we typically think of ROI, but from the standpoint of looking at integrity. And so, Joe, if you want to go ahead and move the slides forward one.
Yep, I will. And just real quickly, by way of introduction, my name is Joseph Morrissey. I am the Vice President of Sales and Marketing for Global Ethics Solutions. With me is Mark Putnam, who is our President and Founder. He'll be monitoring the chat function. So if you have questions or can't hear or any issues, please feel free to use the chat function. And then, of course, we're happy to have John Blumberg, who has an extensive career in consulting, helping companies make decisions. My background is actually in data analytics. It's funny, business leaders can many times be like my 3-year-old nephews, and their question is always why? And in workforce analytics, when you make people decisions, it's always what's the reason, what's the return, what's the value of these decisions. And I'm eager to see that type of approach of what the return is on integrity, because we preach ethics and doing the right thing at Global Ethics. But it'd be nice to know that it actually makes sense to corporations. So we're happy to have John Blumberg here. His book, of course, Return on Integrity, which we'll show you at the end. But John, go ahead and why don't you start? And I'll go ahead and run the slides.
All right. Thank you, Joe. Appreciate it. And so today we're going to be focusing on ROI, but in a way that we don't typically think about it. Oftentimes, the first thing that comes to mind for a top executive is what is a return on investment? And my attempt at ROI here is to get us to rethink when we hear ROI, what we think about. And so today we're going to be focusing on the idea of unleashing the potential of your real ROI, and that's the return on integrity. And so as we focus on integrity today, I want you to think about it in a way that you've maybe never thought about it before. I want to challenge you to think about it in a way that is deeper. I would suggest more challenging. I would also suggest more adventurous than we typically have seen in the workplace. Now, as Joe alluded to, so what is the return? It's a question I often get when I came out with my second book, Good to the Core, Building Value with Values. The obvious question was, well, what is the value of values? And I think from a workplace perspective, I think there are three critical areas that become important to think about. And that is the area of alignment, engagement, and service. And I'd like to think of it not just in terms of alignment of forcing everybody to get into line, but rather to think in terms of a natural alignment. That's something that comes from within. And not an engagement where it's time to do the engagement survey. And so let's get everybody riled up. Let's have a bunch of parties. Let's get everybody excited about being here, but rather an authentic engagement, one that is naturally coming alive. And when it comes to service, not a service that's just a methodology, but something that's genuine. And again, something that comes from within. I often think that when we think about integrity, and frankly, even when we think about ethics, oftentimes what we're doing is we're trying to prevent terrible things from happening. And we certainly have plenty of those examples in the marketplace. But today, I would agree that with integrity, maybe 20% of the formula is an insurance policy to keep terrible things from happening. But I'd rather you see it as the 80% potential that comes when integrity is in play. Now, I would suggest that integrity is something that's a term that we often are better at tossing around rather than that we are actually holding on to and embracing and fully embracing. So it takes us to this definition of integrity. And I think there are three words that help us understand about integrity. And that is, it's the state of being whole, entire, and undiminished. And I would suggest with this definition that that means individually with your mind, heart, and soul, but I also believe that it means collectively. In other words, that when it comes to integrity, it starts with the leader at the top, individually, personally being whole, entire, and undiminished. And then it goes through everyone in the organization. And so you're going to find today that our focus starts at a very personal level and then moves out to a very organizational level. And I would suggest that integrity, often, although it appears on the list of core values of many organizations, I proposed in Return on Integrity that integrity itself is not a core value. That in fact, integrity is the fabric of which every core value gains its value. So let's talk for just a minute, and I want to move forward to the idea that we want to see integrity in 3D. And what I mean by that first is that a leader has to live it. They have to be in the middle of it. You can't lead from the and say, okay, I'm going to lead others by just standing in front of them and watching them do this. But integrity is one of those things that you have to be in the middle of. You have to have personally wrestled with. And so the leader at the top cannot lead others unless they are fully integrated into living it. And so, Joe, if you want to roll out the 3 points in the 3D, there's another angle that I want to look at the 3D. It's the way I actually laid out the book. And that is that we look at it from a standpoint of dilemma. In other words, what makes living values so hard? And the thing you're going to see in a minute is that there's some very good things that create a dilemma. The second thing is to think about, okay, the definition. And we'll look at this idea of actually what are the core values. And I don't mean of the organization initially, but actually of the individual. And when we think about definition, although I named the second section of the book definition, if I could pull it back and redo it, I think I actually would have called it discovery. And we'll come back to that in just a second. And then destiny is, okay, so how do you do this in an organization? And so let's look for a minute at maybe what are some of the things that are the dilemmas. In other words, beyond just our human condition, of our frailty as human beings, maybe not always to live up to our values. Maybe first let's look at the context that we try to live the values in. And so, Joe, if you want to roll to the next slide and drop down the different options there on dilemma. And again, I want you to remember as you look at this list, I want you to think in terms of some really good things that are on this list. Now, for instance, I would suggest that one of the dilemmas that we face in making it hard to genuinely live out and embrace integrity and core values is it's kind of become the new veneer. You hear a lot of organizations talking about core values. They go away, they have a retreat, they come back and they put them on the wall and they get back to business. And in fact, what I suggest here is that oftentimes we look at our core values as a brand rather than the core of the very organization. And I would suggest to you that if you're having your marketing department come up with your core values, it's a huge red flag. Core values are not your brand. Core values hopefully fuel your brand, but if you make it your brand, most often what you've done is you've created a veneer that is not very real. We could also look at the impact of technology. Technology's given us the ability to look at things much deeper, more consistently, which really the next bullet point is one of the major things that can get in the way. In other words, our measurements. We measure more deeply, we measure more, we measure consistently, and you'll never hear me say that measuring in an organization is a bad thing. But I would also suggest that measurements oftentimes create a lot of pressure on core values. And if no one's measuring the measurements to see the impact on core values, that can create an enormous dilemma. And I think oftentimes what we see when there's a failure in an organization from a values perspective, it's because they were trying to meet the measurements. And therefore the measurements got in the way of the values. And so are the measurements being fueled by the values? And valueless measurements are very dangerous. I would also suggest that rewards, it's a bit ironic that we actually reward people for living values. We hold them up as if they're something special. And the paradox there is if the people that are living the values are the ones that are being honored, what does that say about everyone else? And I have nothing wrong. I don't see a problem with shining the light, but it's kind of ironic that we give rewards for the thing that we hope everyone is doing. Now, in Return on Integrity, I took an honest attempt to shine the light on maybe the greatest dilemma, and I wrote a section that simply said that profit is not a core value. And I realize that's very dangerous with the pressure on bottom lines, but let me suggest that I didn't just leave it at that. I understand the importance of the bottom line. So I compared it to actually that profit is like sleep. I don't live to sleep, but if I don't get sleep, then I'm not going to live for very long. And I would suggest that profit is the same. It is a core need, but it is not a core value. And here's the risk. The moment that profit becomes a core value, it will trump every other value on the list. And I think oftentimes we have to look at that in an honest assessment. Now, the other is that we make assumptions. And one of the greatest assumptions that I found was that most people think they know their core values. And the truth is most do not. And so I developed a sophisticated tool that measures this. It's simply called a blank sheet of paper. Ask somebody sometimes, do you know your core values? And a lot of times people will say, well, I'm value-based, or I've got a gut feel or an intuition, which I actually believe would have worked 30 years ago, but not at the speed at which we're moving. And give somebody a blank sheet of paper and say, okay, so what are they? What you'll see is a bit of a puzzled look. And that's the moment of a silent alarm that says, maybe I don't know this as well as I thought I did. And so the assumption becomes a huge dilemma. The same is true in organizational values. Lay out a blank sheet of paper in an organization and ask people to write down the values of the organization. I think you'll find a similar dismal percentage of the people that actually know what those values are. But maybe the biggest dilemma of all is the last bullet, and that is simply what I would call the drift. And Joe, if you want to roll the slide forward, it's a quote that I put in Return on Integrity that seems to have been the one thing in the book that has so resonated. And that is simply this, that we don't go running away from our values. We go drifting away. And one day we wake up in a place that we never meant to be, drifting in a direction we never would have chosen. You see, the greatest dilemma is that it's so subtle. And that it's actually at the moment of a crisis that we begin to realize that we're not where we thought that we were. And the reason is because if you do not know your values, well, let me put it this way. I was speaking down at the University of Alabama a couple of years ago, and we've been talking about values and drifting. And a woman came up to me and she said, John, it kind of dawns on me that how do you know that you ever left if you didn't know where you started to begin with? And that's gold right there, because if you don't know your values, the risk of the drift is much, much greater. So how do we prevent this? How do we actually begin to establish integrity in an organization, starting with the values? And so, Joe, if you want to go to the next slide there. Yeah. So I spent a whole section of the book that we called it definition. And this is where I wish I could take it back and call it discovery, because actually what we want is a definition. Because oftentimes when people go through the blank paper exercise, people will say, now, wait a minute, John. So, okay, I don't think I know now what they are. So what exactly is a core value. I was with a group of managing partners from law firms. It was a lunch and learn, and got to a moment where we were getting ready to talk a little bit more about core values. And the attorney, who was of a managing partner of a major law firm here in Chicago, turned to me and said, "John, what exactly is a core value?" And he was kind of adamant about it. And I looked at him, I said, "Spoken like a great attorney. That's really what you want, right? Is a definition." That's not what we're looking for. We're not looking for a definition of core values. We're looking for what are your core values. And here's what I would ask you to test me on. Go Google core values. And I will almost guarantee you any definition that comes up, you'd look and say, well, yeah, of course, that's what they are. And it's not exactly that helpful, because what we're actually looking for are the values at your core. And so if we go a little bit further there, Joe, on the next slide, I want to try to clarify, because there are some questions that people ask that I think are helpful as we begin to explore. The first is this, is if you want to really know somebody's core values, people often say, well, don't we just have to look at their behavior? In fact, Stephen Covey, in his book, very famous book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and I love the work of the late Stephen Covey. But there's one thing that I would disagree. And many leadership books have also echoed his comment. And that is, if you want to know somebody's core values, don't you just have to look at their checkbook and their calendar? And I would suggest that that's not the case, because I don't know if your checkbook and your calendar have reflected your core values or your drift. And so it isn't necessarily what you're doing now. Or some people would say, well, isn't it aspirational? And I would suggest, no, not necessarily. No, it's not the dream of who you want to be. When you start to dig for your core values, what I would suggest is that we're looking for the truth. And it won't necessarily be aspirational, and it certainly may not be a reflection of your current behavior. In fact, Thomas Merton, he was a Trappist monk. He was he talked, and Joe, if you'll go to the next slide, he kind of simplified this when he said this. He said that there's our false self, and then there's our true self. And our false self is our ego. And oftentimes when I'm working with individuals or organizations, I try to differentiate between our values, our needs, our wants, and our behaviors. And our false self is our ego. And Thomas Merton would say that that is not our bad self. It's just not our true self. And that our true self is where the values sit. And so oftentimes when we start to dig, we have to move past all of the things that the ego drives for us. And by the way, our ego is very necessary. It helps us figure out how things work and how to get things done. But it is not our true self. And so what we have to do is we have to do a lot of digging. And so the digging begins. And I would suggest to you that this will be much harder and much more rewarding than you would ever suspect. I like to think of it in terms of it's like digging down to a water well. Let's just suggest that the water well is 100 feet deep. And oh, by the way, the water is there whether you dig it or not. And here's the challenge, is that you start digging and you're putting a lot of muscle into it to get the hole going, and you get 5 feet in, and then what you realize is that you're still looking at dirt. And then you keep digging further and further, and you get to 25 feet, and sure enough, you're still looking at dirt. 35 feet, 40 feet, 50 feet, 60 feet, you're still looking at dirt. I was with an audience of about 500 people not too long ago, and I said, well, what do you think when you get to 75 feet? What do you think you're looking at? And somebody screamed out, I thought they were going to say more dirt, but they actually said rock. And I said, well, I hadn't thought about that's probably true, because it gets harder before it gets easier. What you'll find is as you're digging for your values, is that it will be a process within itself. And it's the kind of thing that you need to work on for maybe 30 minutes, put it away, come back 2 days later, work on it some more, put it away. But eventually you'll get to 95 feet and you're still looking at dirt, and you keep going because you're so far down at that point. And then eventually you get to 100 feet and there you are at water. Now, I'm not a big fan of looking at a list. In fact, I think that's what we want to do. We want to take the easy way out. And so what we do is we want to look at a list of 30 words and maybe pick the 5 that resonate. And I would suggest that doesn't take us very far. Or look at a deck of cards and try to prioritize. I don't think that takes us very far. No, I think it's much more organic than that. However, what I want to do is be able to help you in the process. So if you just go out to the URL shown on the screen there of at blumbergroi.com/tools, the first tool that you will see is a list. And what this list is when over a period of about 2 years, ask an audience of professionals after audience of professionals to do the blank sheet of paper exercise. I would ask them to write down on another sheet very neatly so I could read it if they would turn in what they first came up with. And over a 2-year period, I collected over about 750 different words. I've never prioritized the list, nor have I ever judged the list. I've never not put something on the list that somebody has turned in, nor do I put it in a certain order of my own preference. It's actually an alphabetical order. And this list is not meant something to just pick and go on the list and maybe just pick out your favorite. It's only designed to stir your thinking. And on this list, you'll see a mixture of values and needs and wants and behaviors. And it's simply designed to stir your thinking. It prints out on about 5 pages. I urge you not to be green with this, but to rather print it out and engage with it and watch what begins to surface for you. I would suggest, again, this is a process over a period of time, and it's something that you work on, put it away, you work on, put it away. But I would challenge you to start first before ever go into this list with a blank sheet of paper and see what surfaces initially for you. And then maybe look at the list and drive your process forward. I would challenge you in the next 30 days maybe to come up with your version 1.0. Here's the deal, and this is really bad news to start with. Joe, if you want to roll the slide, I would just suggest that in your persistent search for your core values, you actually won't find them. Now, Joe, if you'll roll the slide forward again, and again, what you'll see is maybe some good news, and that is that you won't find them, that they will actually find you. Now, you'll notice that I've been focused on the personal side first. And if you're the leader of an organization, or if you're just trying to do this in your own life, I would suggest it's a wrestling match that you have to work through before you can ever lead an organization. And so let's shift for just in our final few moments here, let's shift to look at the destiny. So what does this look like in an organization? I actually wrote Return on Integrity specifically for the leader at the top, the CEO, the president, the executive director. And the reason is because until they can honestly embrace it and wrestle to their own core, it's impossible for them to lead that in an authentic way in an organization. And so you'll see in this graphic here that it starts with the leader at the top. And I would suggest that there's probably about a 6-month process that they have to go through individually before they're in the position to actually lead their leadership team to do the same thing. And again, it's about leading them to be able to discover their own personal values. And then I would suggest it's then and only then. And Joe, if you want to just go back to that slide for just a second, if you can, it's only then that you're able to be in a position as a leadership team to relook at the values of the organization. Now, in ROI, I actually put a 24-question checklist of questions to maybe take the temperature or to assess where you currently are on your own return on integrity in an organization. But I would suggest even if values are in play at an organization, this is a good time based on looking through the lens of your own personal values as a leadership team to say, are those really the values? Oftentimes what you find in organizations is their list of values are not values at all. They're good behaviors. They may be wants or needs, but they are not core values. And so I would suggest the leadership team led by the leader at the top is in the best position at that point to define the values of the organization. And then you can see there, then to lead the employees first to their own personal values, and then to help them intersect those into the values of the organization. Now, here's the thing, is that in the midst of this process, what an organization, more importantly, what individuals can do is become very judgmental with these values. And here's what I would suggest on the next slide. And that is simply this, that core values do not like to be used. And when we're using them to judge others, we actually devalue them. What values like to be is lived. And so the question first becomes, am I living the values in my own core and then the values at the organizational level? So how do I do that day to day? And in the last couple of minutes, I just want to suggest a couple of things. And this is at the individual level, but collectively begins to happen at the organizational level. And that is simply this, is to ask yourself the question on the next slide. And that is, who are my drift guards? And Joe, if you just want to roll to that, what I mean by that is, who are the people that you will give your list of values to and say, I give you permission when you see me drifting to call me out. I was speaking to a good friend of mine, left his big technology career to go be a teacher. And he was teaching middle school, and probably about 8 years into his new career, he called and said, hey, John, can you come talk to this room of 8th grade boys that it's a leadership class that I teach for them. Can you come talk to them about core values, which is kind of terrifying, actually, to go into a room of 8th grade boys. But I will never forget the Q and the A at the end of that class. There was an 8th grade boy that raised his hand and said, John, he said, or he probably said, Mr. Blumberg, do you think other people see you drifting before you see yourself? And it was a really good question that a lot of CEOs have never asked me, but I think he knew the answer without me telling him. But I think we all know the answer, that the answer is often, yes, people will see us drifting before we do. So how do we anchor this day to day? Joe, if you want to go to that last slide, I just call this the PM AM. Now, this is actually going to sound, well, are you kidding me, every day? And the answer is yes, that when you have your list of core values, is that every night when you put your head on your pillow, you just go through that mental list of your core values. Now, a lot of people say, well, how many values should I have? And I don't know the answer to that. But I do know this, that you cannot live what you cannot remember. And so what I would suggest is that every night you lay your head on the pillow and review your day and say, where did my values come alive, and celebrate those? Where did they add value? And then maybe go down the list again and say, where did I not let one of them show up? They would have been helpful if I put it in play. Again, not to beat yourself up, but to simply be aware of that. And then maybe go across the day one more time and say, where did I violate a value? Where did I drift? And every single day, the likelihood, if we're being honest with ourselves, is we drift, and we just notice that, again, not to beat yourself up. And then every morning, I would suggest to look at the day ahead of you and go again across the list of your values and say, where do I get to bring these values alive? Where do I get to put them, engage them? And that's both at the personal level and then, of course, at the organizational level as well. And so the question is, how vulnerable are we to integrity? And there's a risk side of that, and then there's a potential side of it. I'm going to suggest that we have nowhere near tapped the value of values because of the way that we've come at them. And Return on Integrity was an attempt, at the glimpse that we gave it today, is an attempt to dig deeply into the idea of how do we get serious about integrity and values, not only personally, but organizationally. And I hope in the short time we've been together today, it's just tapped your interest enough to begin to at least take your own blank sheet of paper exercise and say, do I really know my values? And if you're leading an organization, then to ask yourself the question, are our values correct? And is there integrity? Are they really in play? And if they're not, it's probably a good chance to look at, one, the insurance that it could provide, and more importantly, the potential that it holds when we do get it right and actually have a return on integrity. Joe, been great to be a part of the webcast today, and thanks everybody for joining us.
And I don't know, like I say, I don't have access to the chat right now, but we can open it up for questions. Mark, if there's any chat questions that came up. And John, I got to tell you, I had a really, really hard time resisting yelling "Roll Tide" when you mentioned University of Alabama. So
I figured you might.
Mark, are there any questions on the chat line?
No, thanks so much, John. Appreciate it. And I just want to mention before you close us out that we do have a YouTube channel that you can access these webinars, and I will put that in the chat right now in just a few moments. So thanks so much.
And for those of you not familiar with our company, we actually provide software and a call center for anonymous reporting for workforce ethical issues, whether it's sexual harassment or cheating or whatever the issues are that people don't feel comfortable talking to HR. We provide both training as well as software and a hotline for companies to make sure that they don't have a bad apple in the barrel. And then be sure to tune into our next event, which is August 3rd, where we're going to actually show the software and give some real life examples of situations where people didn't feel comfortable talking about something, yet they loved having the opportunity to report something anonymously. In fact, one of our first clients was a company that manufactured explosive materials, and they had a guy that was writing odd things on the wall, and they wanted to identify this individual with integrity testing. And in reality, everyone knew who the individual was, but they just didn't want to stand up and be known as the person that called them out. So it's a wonderful service for a company to have, to be able to let employees just voice their concerns without having to go on the record. So we'll talk about that software on October 3rd. With that, thank you everyone. Again, all these webinars are online, our YouTube channel, we'll send the link out. Thanks everyone for coming in.